And we have another guest. This is Nio.
Yes,
Hello,
sir.
Nio.
Can you hear me? Hey, welcome.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Cool.
We can. So just to kind of get an idea, Nio, so what are you a particular kind of Christian? What denomination are you, or non-denominational? Or just give us a bit of info on where you stand with regards to Christianity.
Yeah. I'm an Oriental Orthodox Christian, so I'm part of what's called the Oriental Orthodox Church, one of the 3 apostolic churches. And I believe in the actual Trinity. I don't know what that stuff was that we just heard for the past 45 minutes, but that was scary. I can assure you that that's not the Trinity. That's some type of Hindu nonsense or something. I don't know. I don't know where he got those ideas from.
I think he's an independent thinker, so I don't think he's. I think he's not limiting himself as much as he's trying not to limit God as well.
Yeah.
So, with regards to were you here when we gave forward the idea of the Trinity as we understood it? Did you feel like that first part was fair? And then, is there anything you would like to say with regards to the particular critiques we gave?
Yeah, I listened for just a short moment. I will say that I'll say your objections are based. Forgive me, but your objections are based on some misconceptions about what we actually believe.
Okay.
When we say Trinity, we believe that these 3 are one. We believe that each of the hypostases in God are of course fully God. I think you mentioned that. I would of course disagree that it's illogical. We can get into that if you'd like. And we believe that these 3 hypostases are each identical to God's essence, but distinct from each other. And so they're not different between each other. There's not something in who we call the Father that is not in who we call the Son. And there's only one who. There aren't 3 who's. We believe 3 hypostases, each identical to the essence, distinct to each other by relation, in that one simply comes from the other, and another comes from both in a sense. But they're identical in essence. And there aren't 3 essences. There's one essence. There's one knowledge, one will, one, you could say, set of attributes. And we can say that in many different senses. So to say the least, that's what we believe. We can get into it if you like.
Yeah. So when you say one knowledge, but then in the Bible, I've already made mention to this. So what are your thoughts with regards to the quote where Jesus, alayhi salam, where he makes the claim that only God knows the hour, which suggests a distinction in knowledge as well?
Yeah, by just a surface level interpretation, it seems that that's what he's saying, that he actually does lack the knowledge. But we have to make sure that we read the scriptures through a certain lens. And so we believe as Orthodox Christians, and even Catholics believe this, that is an allegorical passage. So what Christ is really saying there is something much deeper. And it's actually a verse about the Trinity. It's a verse about the Father, who we call the Father, causing his Son to be, or I should say, it's talking about the begetting of the Son, or of the Logos. In that it's not that the Son doesn't know, that he doesn't have the knowledge, but it's that the Father is the first cause, and he has the knowledge not of himself, but by the Father causing him to be. It's kind of complicated. We can get into it though. It has to do with the concept of the Logos, in short. So we do have ancient, which you would call tafsirs of this verse, Mark 13:32, Matthew 24:36.
Yeah.
Stuff
like
that.
So earlier when you were explaining the Trinity, can you just go over that again, because I was a bit confused about what you said.
Sure. So in short, we believe that God is one, and we believe in one God, one consciousness. We believe that there is God and God's Logos. Okay, there's the self in God, the very true God, and there is his knowledge of himself. And God and his knowledge are really distinct, though his knowledge is fully his essence. And so God, he beholds himself infinitely, perfectly, absolutely, because he is all-knowing. His entire being is also in his knowledge. And we call this a second hypostasis, a second underlying reality within God. And we see that this knower and the thing that is known of himself are identical in essence. It's as if, God's looking into a mirror and sees his entire being in the mirror. the image in the mirror, of course, is caused by the one who bears the image. And it's the exact image in this analogy. The physical analogy is not the best. But he's called the Logos because he is the thought which is begotten of the mind of God. In ancient Platonic thought, this is what Logos meant. All of our church fathers say the same thing. The early church fathers, and of course we still teach this today, that the Logos is the exact image of the Father's hypostasis, even according to the scriptures. That's Hebrews 1:3. And we have many, many, many allegorical passages and some straightforward passages alluding to this truth. Yeah. And so, if that makes sense.
Are the Father and the Son the same God?
Yes.
Are they different persons?
Different hypostases, yeah.
Okay, so how can you explain how can they be the same God but different persons? Because that, classically understood, that violates the law of identity.
Sure. So when we say, personally I avoid the word persons in English because people, when we say persons, they think of maybe you and I. They think of three different people or something. They think of the Father talking to someone called the Son, and somehow they're different beings but the same being. Obviously, that would violate the law of contradiction. You can't have two beings in one being. So I prefer the word hypostasis. It's used in the scriptures. It's used in the church father writings.
No, hypostasis is fine, but it
Sure.
doesn't really matter if which term you use, because the claim is that if you are saying, for example, if you say that these two things are the same type of thing, which is God, but they're a different type of thing, hypostases, or person, and we would say in English, okay, how do you actually bridge the gap and explain how they can be the same type of thing, which is God, but a different type of thing, person? Do you understand how that violates the law of identity or not?
No. Because
Okay.
they're the same in regards to essence. They are distinct when it comes to the hypostases. And we see that both hypostases must exist, and that one exists because of the other. So once again, there is God. Now let's all imagine this. No pun intended. God, he imagines himself in his mind. Okay? He has infinite knowledge. He knows everything entirely and wholly. And so when he contemplates himself, his entire being is in the image in his mind. Because he knows all things perfectly, he knows himself wholly and perfectly. So the image in his mind is an exact copy of the self. We call this the self-image or the logos. So once again, God's entire self is in the image in his mind. But the self and the self-image are distinct, not by substance, because everything his substance is in the image, because he is all-knowing. And we see here that even the self-image must exist because it's, of course, necessary that God knows himself. And it's necessary that God is infinite in knowledge and therefore knows his entire self.
Yeah, I mean, we're going on a bit. The point is that when you say that X is the same F as Y, you're actually saying that the two things are identical.
Identical in essence. But
no,
we see
identical in terms of numerical identity.
In that the two are one and are one God. Yeah, but we see that the knower and the known are distinct. Would you agree?
No, what I'm trying to explain to you is that in logic, when you say that two things are the same type of thing, that implies that they are identical to one another and cannot be differed. They cannot have anything different about them in any properties whatsoever. You cannot have two things that are the same type of thing, but a different other type of thing.
I mean, that's why we say they're not different, they are distinct. There's no difference between Father and Son. There's a distinction. This is a real distinction.
They have different properties.
No, we believe there's one set of properties in God, that is his essence. I mean, we believe in only one existence of God. There is not... I mean, you could say that one has conceptual properties, but there's not real properties. There's not something in who we call God and something else in who we call the Logos.
Is the Father
identical?
Is the Father unbegotten?
The Father is unbegotten, yes.
Is the Son unbegotten?
No, the Son is begotten.
Right.
But
so they have a difference about them. They're not exactly the same.
But the distinction is by relation, in that one comes from the other. We're not going to look at what we call the Son, in theory. Let's say we were able to see God, God forbid, but we can't look into who we call the Logos and say, look, there's a property right there that we can't see in this other hypostasis, because the Logos is merely the self. It's the self-image. It's the perfect image of the first hypostasis.
Yeah, but unbegottenness is not a property that can be shared.
Unbegotten. Yes, but when I'm saying it's not a real property. Do you get what I'm saying? It's not an actual thing which is really distinct from the essence.
It is though, because it's either a part of the essence or it's part of the person.
Okay, let's get into.
It's a property of the person of the Father.
It's not a real property, a real thing which is really distinct from the essence, though. I'm sure you would admit that God must know his self. He must have an image of himself in his mind.
Well, it has to either be a property of the essence or it's not. And if it's not, then what is it a property of? You're saying it's not a property whatsoever.
Well, we would say
make sense.
We believe in something called divine simplicity, that God is not composed of parts, and that whatever properties we can attribute to God are his essence. We don't think there's a real distinction between God's knowledge, God's love, God's power, and likewise, we're not going to say that there's something in God called unbegottenness, begottenness, and procession.
Yeah, but are the persons identical to the essence?
The persons are identical to the essence, yes.
Okay, so are the persons identical to one another?
In essence.
Okay, so look, now you're making a clarification. When I say, are the persons identical to the essence, you're saying yes, meaning that they're the exact same thing as the essence, but then when I ask if they're identical to one another, you're not giving a clear yes answer. So that shows that there's something different between the two persons. You're saying these two things are identical to this one other thing, which is the essence. That implies that if those two things are identical to that other thing, which is the essence, they have to be identical to one another, and you can't say that. That's the whole problem.
They're distinct in hypostasis. This is part of the mystery of the Trinity, of course, but we see how it must be the case. And, we're talking about whether or not the Trinity makes sense, right? Of course.
Right.
So, well, we can see this cannot be polytheism. Obviously, it's one God. Since you think the three are identical, even in hypostasis, it's one God. This is the Christian teaching on the Trinity, first off. But would you agree that, well, I guess I have a question for you. Do you believe in divine simplicity, or what is your school of thought in Islam? Are you
no,
we
don't believe in divine simplicity, but before we get into that, we want to stick on this point because you said, well, when I made that point, and I think you understood it, you said, well, at this point, sort of the Trinity is a mystery, which I can understand what you're saying, but I want to make clear that you and the audience understood the point that I was trying to make and give you a chance to resolve that apparent problem. If you don't think you can, and that at that point it's where you have to say it's a mystery, that's fine. I'm not disrespecting you, but I just want to understand that that's what you're saying.
We can see how this must be the case, and of course God has revealed to us that this is the case, that he's a Trinity. As to how it is that his nature exists in this way, I'm not sure. But we can just kind of look at everything and say, well, yeah, there's God, and there's God's self-knowledge. And these are really distinct. Would you agree with that so far? There's God and there's God's knowledge, and these are really distinct?
I don't know if Jake wants to... Sorry, you don't mind me jumping in, do you, Jake?
No, go ahead.
I don't mind.
No, I was going to say, because you mentioned that you believe in divine simplicity. Now, under the doctrine of divine simplicity, the attributes or the persons would have to be identical to the essence, and each property would have to be identical to each other property. You couldn't distinguish any of them.
Well, yeah, but these aren't real properties. These are human concepts that we attribute to God. That's what we call them, attributes.
Yeah, but what about
what is God? He's above these things.
the persons are not just human constructs. They're
these are real
things.
These are real.
So if these three persons are real things and they're distinct, they cannot be identical to one another.
They can be identical in essence, as I've shown that God, if he beholds himself in his mind, in what we call the logos must be an exact image. If there's anything less in the logos, then God does not know his entire self. If there's anything more than the logos, then once again, God does not have a perfect image of himself in his mind, meaning he's not all-knowing. But if he is all-knowing, and if his knowledge is perfect, the logos must be the exact image of the Father's hypostasis, as the scripture says, and as St. Paul said.
Yeah, but let me explain something to you about how identity works. So before you said that let's just take the Father and the Son. The Father and the Son are identical to the essence of God. This is what your claim was. Now, if in logic, if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then it follows logically that A is identical to C. So if you're comparing these two things, which is the Father and the Son, and you're saying that they are identical to the essence, then it follows logically that the Father and the Son are identical to one another, which is the very same thing that you or an Orthodox Christian would want to deny. So that's where the conflict is.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't bring this x equals essence, y equals essence, z equals essence, therefore x equals y, y equals z thing. I think that this can apply to the physical world, but there is no physical analogy for the Trinity. This is a very mysterious thing. As we get into metaphysics, and we see that somehow there must be three underlying realities, though one existence.
Yeah, but this is not a physical law. This is a necessary logical law.
But we see it's necessary that there must be God's knowledge, and that God's knowledge must be the exact image of his self. I can't explain that, but we see how that must be the case because God is necessarily all-knowing. I
think you're understanding the problem, because when I broke it down, you're basically saying, well, this is a physical law. It's not a physical law. It's a logical law, or something that is metaphysical that would apply to God in this sense. Now, it seems almost like you're starting to go down at this point the same path of the previous individual, in which you're leaning towards saying, well, this classical law of identity doesn't apply to God. Is that right?
I'm not saying that. It's possible I lack knowledge on this certain part. It's just I can't explain how there are three hypostases. I can explain how there are, if that makes sense, even though I just repeated the same thing. If we can maybe move on, and it's possible I just don't have the proper answer when it comes to this.
So, no, that's fine.
I can just say that in the beginning, your name is Neo, right?
Yep.
Yeah, so in the beginning, Neo, when you came on, it seemed like you were saying that there was some kind of like a mischaracterization of what we call the logical problem of the Trinity, but then further down the line, you seem to be appealing to mystery and saying that, well, this is mysterious and we can't understand it. So fine, that's okay. I mean, appealing to mystery, I think, in certain cases is fine, but I think that does mean that you do acknowledge that there is a logical problem of the Trinity. Because otherwise, why else would you appeal to mystery?
No, I mean, we believe that there are mysteries. We think that if you could fit God in your head, it's not God.
Yeah, but
I'd say there's a logical problem with saying God has body parts or denying divine simplicity.
Yeah, but at this point, you're at least acknowledging that I've brought up a good point that you have to maybe think about and then come back and have a further discussion on. And I think what Brother Abdul was trying to point out is that in the beginning, it seemed like you were charging us with our basically objections to the Trinity were based on misconceptions. But I think it's been shown now that it's not based on a misconception. It's based on what we see is a legitimate problem, and at the very least is an apparent problem, which you yourself right now don't necessarily have a good answer for. I think that's fair where we're at right now.
Well, I mean, your misconception led to you thinking the Trinity is polytheism because I'm showing you guys, with all respect, you didn't even know what the Trinity was.
I do know what the Trinity is.
Have you heard of the explanation that I give? And have you read the Church Fathers?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Who have you read from the Church Fathers about this?
Well, we don't have to get into.
Let's hear it.
We don't have to get into what I've read, but what I'm saying to you is,
have you?
What I'm saying to you is, I can show you how the Trinity can be understood in a polytheistic fashion. What you're doing and what your model typically would fall under would kind of lean more towards modalism in the collapse of the persons, because of the fact that you cannot explain really how they are distinct from one another by being somehow also identical to one another. So there's a split. There's different models of the Trinity in different directions you can go with it. And either way, when you go one way, you wind up with a sort of modalistic picture, while on the other hand, with things like social Trinitarianism, you wind up with a polytheistic version of God, which even other Christians who reject social Trinitarianism would agree with. And I think even if I explain to you what that is, if you don't know already, you would even agree with it. Okay. So,
yeah, no, I agree. Yeah.
So
that's absolutely
okay, so you agree with the fact that social Trinitarianism results in polytheism, right?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I wouldn't even put the word Trinitarianism in there. I think that'd be a blasphemy. It's just tripartite. It's three beings. It's nonsense.
But you do know, or you should know, that there are a lot of Christians who maybe you're not even comfortable calling them Christians. I don't know. I don't really care. The point is that there are people who are claiming to be Christians, very popular apologists, such as William Lane Craig, Richard Swinburne.
These are Protestants.
Right.
Yeah,
no, Richard Swinburne.
I mean, they're like the Ahmadi of Christianity.
Richard Swinburne,
they got their own thing going on.
Richard Swinburne belongs to the Eastern Orthodox Church. But nevertheless,
I'm not sure he is. Okay.
He does. So my point is that it is popular in Christian apologetics today, especially in contemporary Christian philosophy, in this idea of a social trinity, which you are agreeing is polytheism. So I'm saying that broadly speaking, there's two models. Very broadly, there's two sorts of models. And I'm arguing that if you go one way and you define the persons in such a way that they aren't distinct enough, you wind up with this modalistic problem where they're identical to each other, which is, I think, what you've sort of collapsed into. On the other hand, if you define the persons so separately from one another, then you wind up with social Trinitarianism or a version of polytheism or tritheism. So I don't think that we, especially myself, we've misrepresented anything about Christianity or the Trinity whatsoever. And anytime we did bring up the issue of polytheism, this is sort of what we're referring to. I would say that you don't necessarily have a problem of polytheism right now, but you have an incoherence in your own model in saying that these two things are identical to the essence, but then they're not identical to one another, and this violates the law of identity, which basically collapses into modalism. That's the argument for you.
Okay, so I have a couple questions. So first off, do you believe that there's a real distinction between God's, self and his knowledge? Yes or no?
What do you mean by that?
Between God and his knowledge, do you think that there's a real distinction between the two? There is God and there is his knowledge, and these are two realities within God?
On the Islamic conception?
Yeah, because you said you do not believe in divine simplicity.
No, we don't believe in divine simplicity.
So you believe that there's God and there's God's knowledge.
Are you aware, Nio, that the problem with divine simplicity is that when you talk about attributes or even persons, they are in essence talking about the same thing, and there's no distinction between them. So there's no distinction between. Yeah. So for example, God's knowledge and God's wrath and God's love and God's mercy would all be identical under divine simplicity.
In a sense, and then of course in another sense they're not. Yeah, of course.
No, it's not even in a sense that they're not.
Well, yes.
Under divine. So for example, under divine, one of the criticisms of divine simplicity that has been brought up is the fact that it collapses in which there are no distinguishing attributes within God. They're all identical to the essence. The attribute is identical to the essence.
Yes, but the attributes are merely human concepts that we attribute to him in the first place. So they're identical to the essence in the sense that whatever God has, he is. In the sense in which his attributes are not his essence, they're human concepts that we're observing in creation. We didn't look at God.
Yeah.
We looked at creation and attributed these ideas. So does God really have knowledge? Well, no, he's above that. You know, the scriptures say his true name is unknown to all men. It's above all the names that we attribute to him.
Yeah,
he's the infinite one. He's not
in Origin Neo. So in Origin Neo, I agree with you in the fact that the attributes of God are not something. It's something that we come to understand through the nature of the universe, isn't it? So we're not saying that they are identical to God. Yeah. So we come to know that there is a creator because we sense creation, that there is a necessary being or self-sufficient eternal being because there are contingent beings, dependent beings that exist. So we come to these conclusions. However, under the model of divine simplicity, coming to that conclusion that God is the creator, he's self-sufficient, he's merciful, he has knowledge, all of these necessary attributes as they talk about, would have to be identical to one another and be identical to the essence of God. Under that model, how do you, and you mentioned, obviously you said that attributes are something that we mentally construct, by our observation of the universe. But under the model of divine simplicity, how do you affirm the persons of God as being distinct while also accepting that they're all the same God? It's a genuine question because I've never understood how divine simplicists, if that's the word to use, how they reconcile under Trinitarian view the fact that you have different, persons of God, but they're exactly the same as God, but they're also exactly differentiating between themselves.
Distinct. Yeah, I prefer to use this word. Yeah. So it's a good question. So first and foremost, of course, it's by God's revelation to us that we know this for a fact. He's revealed himself as a Trinity. He's revealed himself as God, his logos, and his internal operation or his spirit, the breath. We can work off of logic and see, wow, this must be the case, because within this self-comprehension analogy, we see there must be a knower, and we must see that there's a thing that is known. Of course, for God to know, there must be a thought. For him to think, there must be a thought. So there's a thinker, there's a thought, and there's a thinking. The thinker uses the thinking to know the thought. Likewise, the thought must know the thinker with the thinking.
Sorry, Jay, go on.
Yeah.
Is it the case? God knows best, but we see that it must be the case. We must appeal to mystery at some point. If we don't, it's a creation that we're thinking of.
Do you think God's existence is necessary?
Of course, yeah.
Do you think God's one act of creation is identical to his essence?
God's in himself, yes, but it is not necessary.
Okay, so God's act of creation is identical to his essence, which is necessary. So again, you wind up having the same issue that you either have what's called a modal collapse. I don't know if you're heard of the modal collapse.
Yes, I do.
So you have, on the one hand, you either have to accept the modal collapse because of what I'm just explaining, or you say there is no modal collapse, and you wind up with the same problem that we just explained about the law of identity. When you say that God's existence is necessary, God's one act of creation is identical to his existence, and therefore that would have to be necessary, but that's the very thing that Orthodox Christianity denies when it says that God's act of creation is free and not necessary. So you have an internal contradiction in your model.
I say that there's something beyond our comprehension that we can't even really explain. When it comes to God being the infinite one, how can we even describe infinity? We can never name anything precisely of God in the first place. Mm-hmm. But to the contrary, if you think that it is not his essence, and that it's something else, there's something else existing alongside for all of eternity, alongside God for all of eternity. Meaning it's another God. It's another existence.
There's nothing outside of God. But anyway,
you believe his act of creation is eternal, right? Or did he begin to create, which would cause him to change?
No. So, you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, see, Neo, what you seem to be doing is you seem to be moving from being a divine simplicity, believing in divine simplicity, yeah, and then moving away from divine simplicity when it becomes problematic because of the logical implication or entailment of that particular belief system, by saying, well, it's a mystery, yeah. I'm just saying is that, look, if you're going to affirm something about God, like saying that God is a divinely simple being, then you have to accept all of its logical entailments for it. I don't think what you can do is simply say, well, we affirm it here when it's convenient, and then, when there are questions that we cannot reconcile because obviously our minds are limited, we suddenly leave it and then appeal to mystery, because divine simplicity, like I said, entails that the attributes are exactly the same as the essence, and there's no distinction between any of the attributes. They're all exactly the same. Now, even if you turn around and say, well, that's a mental construction because of observation of the universe, but when Christians talk about a Trinity, they're not talking about a human construction of God. They are talking about these things as being real things. Yeah, they are concrete realities that exist, but they're on the one hand identical to this divinely simple being, God, but at the same time, you're not accepting the fact that divine simplicity would then entail that they would have to be identical to each other, because that goes against the Christian doctrine, in terms of the fact that they are distinct persons. And that's the problem. The problem here is that you've got two positions, two propositions, or two belief claims that you're holding. They don't reconcile. And it's not the problem of mystery, it's the problem of the claims that are being made are not reconcilable.
Yeah. I think we have a couple other people waiting. We might want to bring somebody else on. Brother Yusuf, I don't know if you're there or...
I don't know if Neo wants to make a little quite last point.
Yeah,
sure. Neo, if you just
but I
want
really
to give
appreciate
like
you
a
coming
closing
on.
remark.
Good.
Yeah. I enjoyed this. I mean, I'll say that, there's apophaticism, there's cataphaticism, of course. I mean, we can say that this cannot be the case. The following things cannot be the case. That God is composite, and so therefore he's simple. How can we understand that he's simple? By being apophatic, we know that he cannot be composite because he's not a finite being. He does not begin to create. He does not change. Therefore, he's outside of time. But what does outside of time even mean? Who knows? God knows. And whatever that is, whatever, the perfect description of that, being outside of time, or of that infinity, the infinite aspect of God, no one knows how to name that, because the name is his essence. No one can comprehend the essence. We only know him by creation. And so at the end of the day, we're always going to be making analogies. Never is there going to be an absolutely perfect analogy. It seems that we can kind of come closer and closer to precision when it comes to this, but we got to be apophatic. We know that God does not begin to create. And so therefore God creates, in a sense, we can say he creates eternally, that is to say outside of time. And because there's only God outside of time, there's nothing else outside of time. Then there's only God's essence outside of time. But seeing that also in concept, or conceptually, we could say that God, his act of creation is outside of time. We can therefore say that God's act of creation is his essence. But again, because these analogies are not absolutely 100% perfect, we have to appeal to mystery at some point. And if we don't, we'd have to say that God is composite, that God is finite, that a human being can understand the fullness in every single thing about God, which of course would just make him part of creation. So, if that makes sense. But I did enjoy this discussion.
Thanks.
Hopefully in the future.
Thanks, Neo.
We can talk
Appreciate
about
you
this
being
again.
on.
Cool. Till next time.
Take care, Neil.